Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Contours, the Cambridge Literary Studies Hour. My name is Atukwesen, and I am Professor and Chair of the English Department at Stanford University. I will be the host of each episode. Each episode of Contours will address a pressing issue, theme, or concept in 21st century literary studies. In many of these episodes, I will be hosting a dialogue with an author or authors from the Cambridge University press list. Others will feature a panel of experts in the field, and I will be introducing those episodes as well. We aim to provide an invigorating, accessible forum for critical debate and reflection to engage and help students, teachers, and general readers. Contours will range from medieval literature to the present day from all areas of global literary studies in the northern and southern hemispheres. Each episode will be approximately an hour long and will be available via YouTube on our new Contours page on Cambridge Core. In today's episode, we'll be focusing on Professor Ian Smith's Black Shakespeare, Reading and Misreading Race. Professor Smith is a Richard H. Jr. 60 and Joan K. Sell Professor in the Humanities at Lafayette College. He is joined by Professor Farah Karim Cooper, the Globe Professor of Shakespeare Studies at King's College in London, Ayanna Thompson, the Regents Professor of English at Arizona State University and the Director of the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, and Michael Whitmore, who was appointed the 7th Director of the Folger Library in July 2011. We hope you find this episode of Contours, the Cambridge Literary Studies Hour, useful, enjoyable, relevant, and more importantly, that you be encouraged to join us again in the next edition. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, my dear friends, really, who have joined me here for this conversation. And happy to see you all, and that you all seem healthy, and so hopefully we can get things going. I guess one of the things I need to talk a little bit about is what prompted me to pursue this line of thinking, or what prompted me to write this book. It will be a familiar story to those who have worked in the field of early modern critical race studies. That is to say, I began thinking about this book because I do believe profoundly that Shakespeare has an investment in thinking about race in ways that I think that we don't fully yet appreciate or understand. Now, having made that claim, there's one sense in which then the book has a kind of a practical function. I then give some readings about some plays. I've chosen 3 of perhaps the best known plays to try to make the point about the significance and importance of race and its impact in reading Shakespeare. So it's a test case, if you like, or test cases, if you like. And so there is this sort of practical function for people who want to think about race in Shakespeare, think about what this looks like when you apply race thinking to Shakespeare. Then the book has that very practical function. And this can work in the classroom, and I think it can work at the classroom at the college level. It can work at obviously in graduate schools, it can work for research, etc. That I think is, so it has a sort of use value in that regard. But the claim that says that Shakespeare has a profound interest in race really comes from a larger debate and discussion. That is to say, from the very beginning of the field of early modern critical race studies, where various scholars decided to begin to write and think through what those claims about race in the early modern period might be, there was tremendous resistance and denial to that way of thinking, to those methodologies, to those ways of trying to scrutinize the plays and thinking about what that might mean. And that resistance has just lingered on and on, really, even to today, some 30 years later. If we think of critical race studies starting in its modern sense in the 1990s. So what does that mean to have this sort of lingering? Now, again, I see my friends here nodding because, as I said, this is but at this point, a familiar story. What I decided to do then is not just to repeat those claims, which is to say race, is resisted, but I wanted instead to examine the causes and effects of that resistance. And that, I think, is what's important for what I'm trying to do. And so on the one hand, I talk about the causes residing in what I call systemic whiteness, and the results or effects are having to do with a sort of racial blind spots, a sort of racial blindness that attends upon us as readers. And that's the sort of short version. We can unpack some of that later on as we go. But that's really what I'm attempting to do here, to sort of answer those questions about cause and effect. Once we begin to think through that set of cause and effects, then we realize that we have to speak about the reader. And so, in a sense, the book resides at the crossroads, if you like, of readership studies and critical race studies, right? Because that's the two sort of fields that I'm bringing together. And so the reader comes up as a central way and as a point of discussion and scrutiny in the discussion that I'm trying to engage in as well. And for me, one of the reasons why I'm so interested in the reader, it's simply because I am, and I've spent my life teaching undergraduates. And so being a teacher is critical and important to what I do. And so I think of my students as readers in the broadest sense, readers who I need to help engage in the acts of reading, but also to help students engage in what it is to look at the evidence that they're marshaling, that the evidence that they're examining, not only because it's important for Shakespeare, but it's important for the work that they will do, for the skills they need to acquire for life beyond college, right? For life in the world. And I think that is true at any level at this point in time, because not everyone is going to do a PhD in English to go on to have a career in teaching. That has become a much more difficult thing to do for a long time. And so we want to be able to provide students with skills, not just the skills then of reading generally, but the skills of how to manage and evaluate evidence, but then also the skills that I'm describing as the skills of racial literacy. How do we become literate with regard to race in the United States, particularly at this point in our culture and our society and our history, when race has emerged as that thing that we have realized that has never been resolved. And we often hear that said, that the question of race has never really been resolved in this country. But more and more, that sort of the urgency of that recognition is upon us. And I think that teaching then helps us to get to that racial literacy, which ultimately is about democracy. And I know that sounds like a big leap, but it's not big at all. It's about how racial literacy is about preparing us to be responsible readers of our culture, responsible people engaging with others in our culture, and to do so in a fair, just, and equitable way. So that's the sort of the scope of the book in some way, from the more local, how do you read and interpret a play, to the larger questions of racial literacy and democracy.
It's such a great book, Ian. I don't know if we're just supposed to weigh in, but I will, because it is such a great book. And I love, I think you help build a theoretical scaffold for something that I've described in my personal journey with Shakespeare, was that I had these amazing professors who were not only great scholars, but great teachers, but whose racial literacy was so inadequate to address the plays to someone like me, who did have a bunch of racial literacy from all of the African American studies and post-colonial studies classes that I had taken. So what I've often described as like that I had a different tool set is woefully inadequate to, when I read what you're talking about, like, because, right, it's exactly that this racial literacy that I had opened up the text for me as a reader, both on a personal level and on a political level and on a scholarly level, that I think my very wonderful professors did not have. And so I think you've put into this book a real clear understanding of the stakes for engaging with these texts with a different set of literacies. And it's not, and what I also like about your work is that it's not the only literacy that you will need. You will need a whole bunch of them going forward, right? And can we do the eco-critical with the racial, right? You're not closing off anything. You're in fact inviting us in to think about all the different types of literacy that we need to bring to bear to any text. So I just want to thank you for this brilliant and beautifully written book.
Thank you. So, yes, Farah, please.
No, I was just going to second what Ayanna said, but do respond.
Oh, no, there wasn't a real response. I really was just going to underscore what Ayanna is saying, which is this question about, because so many of us have that experience of reading text or being in a classroom and the sense of not being being heard. I mean, for a long time, from an undergraduate all the way through to graduate school, I would always think that what I was doing was wrong or crazy, because when I would try to explain to my professors, they'd have this sort of like blank, glassy look, and they couldn't quite understand what it was I was trying to say or do. And this is why I must say, certainly in the United States context, there was one person who gave me that permission, and it was Jean Howard. When I explained to her what I was trying to do, and I was expecting the same kind of glassy-eyed response, she said, sure, yes, go write that. And I was shocked because I thought, you understand? And she said, of course, I understand what you're saying. So what Anne is saying is very real to those of us who are trying to do the work. And that, I think, applies, as Anna said, across a number of fields. And so it's really a plea for patience and for recognizing the students or the persons who are in front of us, and to pay attention to their humanity and their intellect and their engagement and their experience and what they're trying to communicate to us and with us. And just to try a little harder to make that real for them and to validate that for them as something that is worthwhile and valuable for us all as well. So thank you, Anna, for saying that. Farah, sorry.
No, I was just going to 100% agree with Ayanna. I think what I really like about your work, I mean, you said that you don't want to just simply reiterate that Shakespeare is invested in race, and that this is a period of racial formation. But the necessity of repeating it is just ever there, isn't it? And I was really struck by some of the language that I had written down certain words, because this is the experience of having conversations about race in relation to Shakespeare in the wider academy. Words like resistance and deferral and displacement and defensiveness. And I think the thing that interests me the most is defensiveness. And it is, Ayanna just sort of hit the nail on the head in that when you're training in English literature, you're not given a kind of multidisciplinary sort of rubric. You're not given these texts, look at this sociological, this psychological, look at legal, economic aspects, African American studies, Black feminism. You're just given English literary criticism. And so that racial literacy has to be shifted by this absolute embrace of the multidisciplinary approach, which I think is really beginning to happen, but it's a huge, huge process. But I just want us to kind of just talk a little, I'd love it if you could just say more about defensiveness, because that seems to be the most overwhelming. And of course, it's much more culturally broad, isn't it?
Yes. So a little bit of the history then to contextualize the defensiveness, or what I call resistance and denial. I'm using those things somewhat synonymously here for this conversation. And I do write about this in the book, but I find it so moving. With this, James Baldwin in the 1950s writes in Nobody Knows My Name. He writes about that experience of saying, well, I'm going to travel through the South. And he chooses the South, I think, for obvious reasons, because it's sort of the history of the country and sort of the North-South division. But what that North-South division means in terms of questions of race and culture and his history. And so as he travels through the South and he begins to sort of look at the people and engage with people, as he begins to write the essay of that experience, he talks about the thing that so defines American culture, which is, and he describes it in that almost innocuous but so right way. He says it's looking away. He says Americans have this tendency to look away. And I love that, because it is theatrical in some sense, right? It's the looking away. You can imagine people not wanting to engage, and so therefore looking in the opposite direction, deliberately and consciously looking away. But looking away also has a sense of of epistemology, of knowledge, based on the idea of looking and seeing and knowing. So it's the refusal to also know and engage. And so I think that the idea of sort of defensiveness, of not wanting to know, is so much a part of American culture, as Baldwin says. You have Toni Morrison, who talks about the Africanist presence in American culture, and yet there's a way in which we continue to downplay that or hide that or elide that, she says, right? And then more recently, we have Ibram Kendi, who says quite bluntly and memorably that the heartbeat of America is denial. The heartbeat of America is denial. And so there we have across 60, 70-year span that I just sort of traced very quickly, this idea, certainly from a modern perspective, of that sort of resistance and denial and defensiveness that is so critical to who we are. Now, might I throw in here then another thing that goes back over 100 years ago, which is W. B. Du Bois. Du Bois, in The Souls of White Folks, as he begins the opening of that text, he describes America, and he's trying to understand what it is that is the engine of this culture, what makes this culture move, what makes it happen. And he talks about whiteness as based in possession and ownership, and the refusal implied to give up what one possesses and what one owns. So if you bring together that defensiveness on the one hand that some scholars identify, and then Du Bois's notion of possession, we get a sense of what's at stake in the defensiveness and the denial. It's about ownership. One doesn't want to admit or open up these questions, to these questions of race in our culture. One wants to look away, because if one is going to look at or look with, then one has to begin to think about how then do I manage differently my sense of possession and ownership? What is that going to look like? Now, that's very true, I think, in the culture at large in terms of the politics in the larger sense of that term. But think of what that means in, say, Shakespeare studies or literary studies, where the field is, one could say, literally owned by and possessed by for a very long time. So that denial that we're all still we remember from the 1990s, that sort of resistance, one can argue that in Du Bois's terms, it's about that refusal to let go because one has owned this thing called Shakespeare. One has owned this field and one possesses it as one would like to possess America. And to ask in some way, which is what I think those pioneers in our field were doing in the 90s, right? They were saying, let us think about these questions and it will come with a cost, but a cost that will, it's an investment really for all of us. And the answer was, we don't want to share. We don't want to do that. And I think Du Bois is so right here that unwillingness to share is really quite powerful, because in Du Bois's notion of possessiveness is also an ownership, is also the implications of capitalism, right? We don't want to share. We're not going to give this thing up. So I think to your question, it has all of this weight built into it. So when those scholars were doing that work in the 1990s, and then others came along afterwards, like my friends here on the screen, we were wading into deep waters, really. Sometimes I'm not sure if I was aware the depth of the waters I was wading into, but that's what we were up against, and to some degree still up against.
Ian, if having to follow the prior two speakers is, I feel like everything I will say is redundant, but just your response to Farah and to Ayanna, I think, demonstrates two things that are so clear about the book, but it's also clear about you, is there's tremendous intellectual force and depth to the arguments, and it is linked to real elegance of thinking and exposition. When I think of books that have changed Shakespeare studies, they've had that mixture of a deeply satisfying intellectual architecture, where the concepts, for you, systemic whiteness and racial blindness, are working in such a complementary way that almost automatically evidence in the plays starts to jump out. And, which is one thing I would say about why this book is like similar interventions, and I think of Janet Edelman's very powerful close readings of the plays and her ability to link them to psychoanalysis. Not only is there a very powerfully articulated theory of how race works as a concept, but then compelling readings at a level of detail that is absolutely necessary to make this case. And as I think about my own reaction to this book and how the world will react, because it is such a significant book. One thing that I was curious about, and I would love for you to reflect on, there's unsatisfying readings of Shakespeare's plays, and they tend to say, here's an allusion, here's a second meaning of this word, and it makes me think of this. And it feels personal and reflective, and that's an opening and a beginning to thinking about what these words mean. But when I think of your work on, say, Hamlet, and the density of the language and the connections and the theatrical history that you bring to bear on this play, that I think the received wisdom even in the 21st century is that this is not a play about race. This is another kind of play. And what you've done in the final, in the chapter about Hamlet, is to demonstrate why it must be a play about race. And in doing so, it does this other thing that your book does, which is it calls attention to this real mismatch between an abundance of racial constructs and concepts that are all over the plays, and then this real scarcity of awareness that it's there. Mm-hmm. And it's a simple thing that you do, but you can only do it if you've built some incredible scaffolding to get to this point. But to say there's a reason why there's that mismatch, and the reason is systemic whiteness and racial blind spots. And I think at that point, you've managed to connect a phenomenon that's happening in the reader and in our field to a real evidence trail that demands to be seen. And my question for you, Ian, is, as you sit on the far side of this work, what is left for us to see that is unseen, even within this subfield? Because, as you say, critical race studies has been developing for decades. But if it's the intervention that I think it is, many other things will follow from it. And I wanted to know what your aspiration would be as a follow-on to this opening gambit.
Perhaps that it's not a subfield.
Yes, thank you.
I thought we were all thinking the same thing, Michael.
That's hilarious.
And the short answer to that question is, if in fact
systemic whiteness.
Yes. if the premise is true, then it can't be a subfield. It is the field. Yeah. And it's something I did in an early, and I'm not answering your question yet fully, but maybe I am, because Ayanna, thank you for sort of underscoring what was going through my mind as well as I heard that. In the book before this that I did on language and race, one of the points I made there, which I'm not sure if, I believed it, but I'm not sure if it somehow got through for any number of reasons, is that if indeed language is racialized, as I tried to argue there, because the truth is, in 20th century America and 21st century America, nobody doubts that language is racialized. We all assume that to be true. We pick up the phone and we hear someone on the phone and we think, oh, that person is X, based on simply what they sound like, how they speak. That's what we do. So at its most basic level, we all know and practice a certain kind of sort of racial linguistics, right? But we somehow pretend that we don't. And then when we shift to the early modern period, suddenly it's like, well, that doesn't happen. That is absurd. Now, what I've tried to do in that book then is not just do the sort of simple pick up the phone version. I do a very sort of layered reading of the classical rhetoric, et cetera, et cetera. And the point is, if it is true then that there is this distinction between sort of elegant rhetoric and barbarism, if that's true, then everything we've been taught, as Farah was saying, that we in literary studies have been taught this sort of canon of English literary criticism, whatever that means. Well, everything we've been taught about the language arts and how all these writers were so invested in language and rhetoric, etc. But it stopped short of acknowledging that all of that was deeply racialized. That is to say, that eloquence is deep and profoundly national, it's English in the making, and it's white in process. And if that's true, then everything that we read in Shakespeare and the early modern period is already racialized. So to Ayanna's point, it's not a subfield, it is the field. But the way we continue to sort of be unaware, I think, of the sort of profound nature of the claim in which I began. Race is much more pervasive in Shakespeare than we still imagine. Then we somehow don't yet have the language to speak in that way. And I think that there is a lot of work we can do to still convince people to sort of just take a pause and think through what that might mean. Now, Michael is going to ask, so you're asking me, so beyond that response, you're asking, what do I hope, or what do I, for my own work, or what do I hope for the field?
Yeah, I think I will reframe, after having just been a living illustration of some of the concepts in this book. Here's what I want to say.
Yeah.
I think that you've put perfectly the shift, which is that this seemed like a personal area of interest and inquiry, and then it becomes the mainstream and one of the things that we always have to talk about when we talk about Shakespeare. So it is Shakespeare studies. And that's a legacy of this book. Once it has become one of the first things we see when we read, what other work is there to be done? Because I assume that every student who reads Shakespeare will become literate, racially literate in the ways that you describe. And there's more to do beyond the areas that you cover in this book and the traditions that you do. So I wanted to kind of ask you to look to the far horizon, which perhaps only you and a couple of other people, some of whom are on this call, can do. But what do you see is the next piece, given the remit and what I think is a successful intervention of the book?
Right. And I do want to hear the points of view of the other, because clearly I'm surrounded by brilliant and experienced scholars. I'd love to hear what they have to say. What I have to say is, at this point, somewhat, I would say, small and large all at once. On the one hand, I do see that for me at any rate, I need to keep working on this question of whiteness. In part because for a long time, and I think it was important for that to happen in early modern critical race, in Shakespeare studies and early modern studies, sorry. I think that for a long time, we thought that we needed to work on questions of Blackness and as a kind of stand-in for, other forms of race. And so we did that, and a lot of work has been done in that area and continues to be done. One of the reasons why it was important for me to think through what I've done in this book is that it became more and more clear to me over the years that the question is not so much about now demonstrating where Blackness is, although that for me is an interesting question still to do that kind of work, right? That's fine. But the question really has to be, what is whiteness? Because without whiteness and the political interventions of whiteness, Blackness as a political identity wouldn't exist, certainly in the Western world as we understand it. So looking at Blackness alone is once again doing the sort of bifurcation. We're looking at the after effects and we're not looking at the cause. And so we need to think about what whiteness is as a historical phenomenon and really press that much more and understand that it is important for us to understand what that really means and what that's about and its role and function if we're going to really do the work that's important to pre-modern critical race studies. Now, I understand why in the early moments in the 1990s, we didn't say, oh, we need to do whiteness. But this is why I indeed talk about Toni Morrison's 1992 book, at every moment I can, practically, because she understood in that book, when you look at the list of books on whiteness studies, there is this one book that keeps coming up, and it's her book, Playing in the Dark. And it's the only book that's on literature and on American literature. The other books are books by historians and so on, for the most part, not literary scholars. And I think that part of that has to do with, if we're starting to build a field, the sense might have been to initially start working on whiteness at that point might have seemed strange, a strange choice. It might have seemed a strange choice then. There's a need to sort of build archives, so to speak, back then to say, well, here is this thing that we are interested in, let's build this. Now, 30 years later, because some things just take time and require time. So these 30 years later, I think we are in the place now where we can say, okay, we have been doing that and we can continue to do that work, but we need to understand what was always there. And don't get me wrong, I mean, scholars have always talked about whiteness along the way. It's not that nobody did that, not at all. But that we need to sort of give it our fuller attention, I think, for the reasons I gave before. It is the cause, not to quote Othello.
Let me not name you chase stars.
That was not intentional. It is the cause rather than the effect. So I think we need to do that kind of work. So I think that's important, and so that's what I want to continue doing. At the same time, I think there are other kinds of questions with regard to, again, for me, how will this affect how we teach and how do we teach students and how we can do the work of helping students sort of navigate these texts. That is always on the agenda for me as something practical to do, because I think that is work, a certain kind of work that needs to be done for the reasons I gave before regarding what it is to build a just and fair democracy through understanding the role of education in that long and slow process. So that's my sort of answer, but I'd love to hear what others think.
Well, if I may, I would say that I think what your book sets us up to do, both in scholarship and in our teaching, is to teach our students, teach our fellow citizens to stop historical amnesia, right? To stop the lens of analysis only being 10 years or maybe 20 years. Even in critical race studies, right? Like their lens of analysis goes to 1968 and that's about it, right? So, but to say like, actually, we have to have this larger historical arc for us to preserve our democracy, right? For us to shore up our democracy, for us to recognize what our democracy is for. And I think your book does that. I think your book sets us up to say, slow down, return to the text. There is so much pleasure in the close readings that you provide, so much surprise and delight. And that's something that I think we need to show our students so that they can say, right, this isn't something that just happened in the last 20 years. It's not a 21st century phenomenon, but actually it has much longer legs, and there might be joy to be had in exploring those longer legs. And I think that's what your book demonstrates beautifully, right? I mean, because it's such a beautifully crafted book, to reiterate something that Mike said that got lost in our mocking of you, Mike, which was that the craft of the book is so astonishing and delightful and welcoming, right? That you want to enter in. So, and I think that is an amazing thing to demonstrate to our students. So, Farah, I'll kick it over to you.
I guess I just kind of want to go back to this, what you're trying to do in terms of rendering whiteness visible and us to kind of constantly keep that buoyant. Because it makes me think about the other body of work that was emerging in the 1990s, which is the focus on the body and how the early modern body is it's that invisible whiteness again. It's the white normative default position. And so trying to get our students to think about, well, what bodies are you referring to? And that involves a huge amount of sort of racial blind spot correctives. So that's, continually, I suppose, problematizing race neutrality in that way, I think, is one of the projects that your book is going to inspire. But I think also the other thing, something that all of us have been engaged in, is that public engagement and performance studies, because that's really the kind of racial blind spots you see within performance and performance practice. That your book has a huge amount to instruct in theater companies, artists, and that's the kind of work I know, Ayanna, you do and that I've been working on. And this is an incredible opportunity for that whole world to kind of redress some of these issues, because race neutrality kind of defines Shakespearean theater making. And it is hugely problematic and still very much one of those great rocks that we have to keep pushing up a hill, right? So, and I think that corrective in terms of racial blind spot really could work across the arts. When you think about art history and the issues that they have in that discipline with regard to Black presence in art. So I think there's just multiple opportunities across disciplines for your work to amplify some of those issues.
Thank you. In fact, one of the questions I wanted to ask the group, and you touched upon it just now, so I don't know if you want to say some more, but because I thought, well, I do have three people who are, to a greater or lesser degree, involved in performance studies. And I thought, well, let me sort of capture you all and ask you this question. In fact, how do you see, if does this work, in fact, translate into that field? I mean, I say it does in the book because I intend, for me, reading is a very expansive term that covers that kind of work as well. But yes, I have three people who are in one way or the other related to theater and performance. So please, do you have anything to help me understand how that could work in that area?
Farah, you should start. You've been working in theaters the longest.
Well, I guess it's one of the issues that I suppose we've been dealing with for a little while at the Globe, which is the bracketing of race plays and then the rest of the canon. And so race never needs to be an issue or a conversation because it's not a topic in a play like Hamlet or elsewhere. And that's something that I think your book can really address, is looking at it really as context, as the kind of field, as it were, as you described, rather than it's simply a topic. Because I think what a lot of directors tend to do is think about, they nowadays there might be a little bit more literacy around plays like Othello, you hope, and The Tempest, or any of the so-called race plays. But there isn't the kind of race consciousness or racial logic being applied to sort of the script edits, to the casting process, and even in the rehearsal process. And I think that those, some of the sort of tools that you provide in your book could be applied really easily there.
Yeah. And I just to piggyback on what you said, Farah, I mean, I think there's a kind of double-barreled issue going on, right? There's the theaters who are like, oh, this is the race play, Othello, and these are the normal plays. And then the other issue is we recognize that we have woefully underrepresented our population. So whatever play it is, we'll just put in an all-black cast or an all-black and brown cast or whatever. And then, so there is a major theater company doing what I think will be a largely predominantly black Hamlet coming up. And I wonder how your analysis of the play's anti-blackness can be incorporated, or if they'll just say, no, I can't even go there, because then that like messes up my concept so much. And I think so. Part of what I think is important for all of us in theaters is to have longer conversations with the makers. So that because traditionally you'll be brought in at the last moment, the concept's settled, and you're like, well, like, if that's the concept, I'm not sure like how much, there's all this scholarship that would, contradict your concept. So sorry, like, so, but just to have longer and more sustained conversations about the careful, close work that you demonstrate, I think will be very, very powerful. So that does, I think, ask theaters to put in place structures that they might not normally have for these kind of sustained dialogues. And I'll pitch that to Mike, because maybe you have the ideal place that could create those structures, right, at the Folger Shakespeare Library.
Well, we have the benefit of being in dialogue with you, but also putting on our own independent artistic work. And one thing that strikes me about the performance conversation is that actors themselves are reacting to the racial dynamics in the plays and are ready to talk about that. So an all black and brown or nearly all black and brown Hamlet, for example, the Black Pyrrhus lines that Ian highlights in his close reading will feel a certain way to the actors. And I noticed it this summer when Victor Malong Maog directed Midsummer Night's Dream, and lines like "Away, you Ethiop." When a multiracial cast is putting these stories together, those lines can land differently. They can also become part of the banter if they're contradicted by the perceived racial status of the actor. So it's really a set of opportunities that have opened up. And I think, Ayanna, one of the things you're saying, which needs to be repeated, is that good work and that awareness and that comfort actually negotiating the racial dynamics of these plays and the rooms in which they're performed, there needs to be real investment and scaffolding for that, because it won't just happen. And I think that's one of those areas where any of us who's involved in working theater just sees the investment need. And, as a leader of a nonprofit, I always worry about resources. But this is an area where once we embrace the idea that we should be thinking about the diversity of voices and identities that are all over our institution, including our stage, that the care and intentionality and courage required, including a culture of trust, is absolutely necessary to do good, exciting artistic work in this area.
Yeah,
And equally,
oh, go ahead, Farah, sorry.
I was just going to say, and equally, that you need to provide that scaffolding, as you often call it, Ayanna, for the audience as well. Because when we do this kind of work in the public eye, the globe always gets roped into the culture war. And even Ian came and gave a wonderful webinar, an anti-racist webinar series on Hamlet, and spoke really eloquently with one of our actors about it. And of course, it gets picked up by a conservative, anti-woke press saying, scholar says Hamlet is racist, and they just pick up the little tidbits and decontextualize it, which is frequently happening. So how do you then, you move past it, and finally you've got the theater company doing what they need to be doing, but then what do you do to support the audience response?
Yeah. Yes, and I think the key word that Mike used, and that works with what you were just saying, Farah, is that it is an investment. It's an investment that is a cost that will pay out later, right? Like the long-term payout is worth that initial investment of setting up that scaffolding for your makers and for your audience. And I think of your book, Ian, as a demonstration of an investment, right? Like this is how much time and labor you put walking us through these crucial readings as something that will have like these immense dividends in the future for all of us and for our students and for our audience members and for our theater makers. So I just think I'm just going to double down on investment. Yes, it's worth it.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Well, and thank you very much for helping me think through some of the, and those that might be listening at some point, think through the sort of performance issues, because I'm always asked performance questions, and because I don't really do performance work, I always feel a little bit bereft. I'm not quite sure what you want me to say, but so I can always point to you. Thank you so much. I'll say one more point before we begin to sort of wrap up, because I think we're coming close to the end of our hour. Which is to sort of circle back to where I began and to talk about and this is the question that Farah pressed about defensiveness and so on. For a long time, I didn't quite understand what that defensiveness was about. Over time, it's become clear to me that it was about a lot of things. It was, as I said, it was about sort of protecting one's area of expertise. It was protecting one's sense of one's professional identity, and so on and so forth. But I do want to focus on this notion of protection, because there is a lot of white protectionism going on when we do talk about this sort of denial that I laid out before. But what's clear to me now is that when you protect whiteness, to the degree that we've seen it, and to the degree that Baldwin, Morrison, Kendi, Du Bois talk about this, but if we protect whiteness, then we leave blackness vulnerable. That's what that means. And I want to underscore that, because as we look around us today in our society, we do see the results of that kind of investment that investment in whiteness and protecting whiteness that continues to make and leave Blackness and other kinds of racial identities vulnerable, extremely vulnerable. So, and I think as we bring these sort of conversations to our students and to our friends and in the sort of theater contexts, we can indeed talk about the ways in which violence has begun to play such a significant role once again in our society around questions of race. It's never really disappeared, but we are talking about it. We see it happening. It's become a very troubling constant in our lives. And I'll close on this one point. A few semesters ago, I was teaching a course on a race theory course, and students would use the expression Black violence when they were describing violence perpetrated against Black people by whites. They would repeatedly call that Black violence. Now we can see the sort of shift of what the use of the word Black, but I kept stopping and said, hold on, no, call it what it is. It's white violence. That's what that is. And so I just want to end on the sort of note of urgency once again. That is to say that the work that I would like to see us do is to help forestall, to help shift, to help change, to help challenge ourselves and our students, our friends, and those around us to understand why this work is so important. Yes, it is a classroom thing, but it is a social and cultural thing. It's a historical thing. Because if we don't pay attention, then we are seeing what that has meant for the last 400 or 500 years, that if we continue to protect whiteness, then Blackness and other kinds of racial identities become more and more vulnerable and more vulnerable to violence. I'm not suggesting that Shakespeare studies equals what's happening in the world today, but it's a place where we incubate those habits and practices that we see manifest in the world today in very dangerous ways. And so that's my final appeal and call.
I think we should leave it there, Ian. It's the perfect note, right? That what we do matters.
Yeah.
And thank you all so much. Thank you, my friends, for being here with me in this conversation. And thank you, really, I learned a lot. And thank you for supporting me along the way, all these years in the work that I do.
And I'll just
Thank you for this book.
Buy the book, buy the book, buy the book. And
Congratulations.
And I will also say thanks to Cambridge for publishing this important work. So
Yeah.
thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.